You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
And this is Creep Street. As always, up top, follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod. Please hit us with a 5-star review. It helps us out. It helps spread the Creep Street gospel, baby.
Also, if you could share this, put it on your story, let a friend know about us.
Amen.
Post us on your freaking MySpace.
Evangelize, baby. Go forth and multiply.
Woo!
Also, just wanted to talk, as you know, we do have a Patreon as well. I want to just real quick, because we've kind of updated our Patreon.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to give a real quick recap. We have a $2 tier, a $5 tier, and a $10 tier. The $2 tier, we've added a Discord chat as well as random content drops for all three tiers. So even if you're at a $2 level, you get that one-time shout out, but you will also be a part of the Discord community, and you'll get at least one drop of content, bonus content every month. And then of course $5 you get the one-time shout out and a bonus episode once a month, and the random content drops. And of course at the $10 level you get a shout out every show, you get a bonus episode every month, and you get a movie commentary watch along with Maureen and myself.
That is correct.
Speaking of shout outs,
Speaking of top tier elite Patreons.
The Creep Street Elite, ladies and gentlemen, are Creep Street connoisseurs at the $10 level. The Dream, James Watkins. The Finnish Face, Via Longfist. The Vivacious Vicky McHugh. The Notorious Nicholas Barker. And published author.
Yes, very exciting.
Check out Inhumanity by Nicholas Barker. The Oh So Suave, Sean Richardson. The British Bonebreaker, Bex Martin. The Madman, Marcus Hall. The Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, and the Heartbreak Kid, Chris Hackworth.
Woo!
Once again, if you would like to get in on that Patreon, all those goodies, this is the month to do it, because there's a lot of goodies coming. Just go to www.patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast.
That's right.
Now, God, let me tell you something.
Dylan, are you okay?
We are in the throes. We're in the thick of October.
The thick of it.
We are in the thick of it. We're in the weeds. You know what I mean?
We're absolutely, could you say balls deep in October? You could.
Balls deep.
Is it ladylike of me to say no?
Please.
Has my mom talked to me about being more ladylike, just in general? She has, ever since, I was a young age.
Yeah. And today we are talking about, this is a crown jewel.
It is a crown jewel. It is a crown jewel in how it is so notorious. How it is so damning. It's so embarrassing even.
Yeah.
In fact, President John Adams.
Second
president, if you've seen Hamilton or listened to it. That was a joke, by the way. He also was the actual president. John Adams cited the trials as a foul stain upon this country. We are talking about the Salem Witch Trials.
Oh, yeah.
The Salem Witch Trials, everyone, taking place in I always say it, but it's never been 19. It's always been 1692.
Yeah.
There are so many huge witch hunts and witch trials and witch scares around the world and throughout history.
Right.
And there have been so many very, very compelling cases that we're going to cover lots of those different witch hunting episodes. I think we'll really come back to really the height of the European witch trials. And those really informed Salem. So basically, for those, a quick primer, if you will. Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 was a completely different place than what it is today. There has been a history of witch trials and witch hunts throughout the years. And this was something that the people living in Salem in 1692 were aware of. They were very aware of this. For example, there was a huge influx of witch sightings, if you will, or accusations in Sweden.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, and that was kind of, but this was, hundreds of years before.
Right.
But they kind of use Sweden's case of this as a map of what they want to do or what they want to avoid.
Interesting. Okay.
So let's take it back to 1692. But before we get going, I want to talk about my source for this week. It is an incredible book called The Witches: Suspicion, Betrayal, and Hysteria in 1692 Salem, written by Stacy Schiff. I cannot recommend this book highly enough.
It sounds awesome.
It's such an amazing read. It is full of information. It's, 100% nonfiction. It goes into the detail of everything that happened in Salem during the trials, but it also adds so much information that kind of gives context and it makes it understandable to you. You're not just reading a bunch of court reports,
right,
which were not very reliable, as we will see. So the Puritans that were living in Massachusetts, all over New England, but especially Massachusetts, are a very unique kind of person. What they went through and what they sacrificed. So these Puritans moved to New England to worship with more purity and less peril than they could do in the country where they were. So they were very, very excited to be in this new country, even though it technically to them was still a part of England. But because they were so isolated from London, news took a long time to get back and forth, and news was often very unreliable. That's really something that I think kind of runs its way throughout this whole story.
Right.
Is that there's so much rumor and conjecture and assumptions, as well as just false reporting, as it were, that really affects so much of what happens in this case. Now, in the book, Stacy Schiff, she says, and she puts this very, very clearly, I quote her book, she says, "They tended towards fissions and factions, strong opinions, righteous indignation. Like any oppressed people, they defined themselves by what offended them, which would give New England its gritty flavor, and it's been argued, America's independence. Rigorous Calvinists, they had come a great distance to worship as they pleased. They were intolerant of those who did so differently. They were ardent, anxious, unabashful, incurably logical, not quite Americans, of as homogeneous a culture as has ever existed on this continent." So these people had a very specific way that they thought life should be lived.
And they were a close-knit.
Exactly. Super close-knit community. Also, New England, they were really in the wilderness.
Yes. Pair that religious fervor with the fact they're in a place pretty much on the other side of the fucking world.
Exactly. I mean, yeah.
And they're living on a sliver of land of a country that is huge.
Right. They have
huge.
No idea. No clue.
It's huge. And they know it's huge. Of course, there's going to be things in the woods.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. When the devil is already at the forefront of your mind, and now you're in a completely different part of the world.
Exactly.
It was kind of an unfortunate, perfect storm for all of this to come together.
Exactly. And also, even though a lot of these people had, at this time, were born in Massachusetts or New England, some of them weren't. Some of them, did come over from England. Whether or not they were born in Massachusetts, I think the Puritans as a whole were still kind of grappling and shocked by what New England weather was.
Yeah.
I always kind of forget that England and, the UK in general, their weather is so much more mild than what is normal in New England, which is also the same as the weather is almost exactly the same as it is in Chicago. It is here.
Yeah,
so that's why we feel we can talk about it.
It can get brutally cold.
It can get so fucking cold, and it can get so hot.
And hot, which is fucking weird.
It's a huge difference. And also, like you said before, the things lurking in the forest, those things weren't so hypothetical either.
Right.
There really were wolves, there really were
Yes.
bears, there were these things. It was much more wild at the time.
Exactly.
And there was also huge conflict with the American Indian tribes.
Of course, right. And
Yes.
so you have that on top of it, and
Right.
a great window, not to get off topic, but a great visual representation of this time would have to be the movie The Witch.
Yes.
Which does not have to do with the Salem Witch Trials. You know, it's a fictional film about a family being terrorized by this malevolent force. But in terms of authenticity in how people dressed, how they spoke, it's apparently dead on. Even the way they speak English in the film is apparently, they think, pretty dead on to how English was spoken at that time. It's a very authentic movie in that regard. It's if you want kind of a snapshot into what life would have been like, scary stuff aside, witches and all that stuff, just a snapshot into what life would have been like, I would say that movie, it was not a pleasant existence.
Yeah, spoiler alert, it's bleak.
Right.
So these Puritans were surrounded by wilderness. It was very hard to survive there due to the weather. And now the Native Americans were not the only ones that were also imposing a threat to them.
Right.
Also, there was the Frenchmen were around the area that they were also trying to get land. So that was another, they were worrying about that. There were Quakers nearby that they felt were devilish, sinful.
The Quakers?
Yes. Yeah, they really were like, you are with us or you are against us. They weren't like, oh, okay, you're close enough.
Wow.
So they really were in a tough spot. And kind of like what you said too before, like life for them, not only just for survival reasons, things like that was rough. It also was just kind of like a rough life in general, where you really just had to work all day. Life was all about which class you are and kind of deferring to the hierarchy, constantly just working. And if you weren't working, you were praying. When you would go to church, you would be there for, 8 hours a day. And then when you got home, you were just supposed to read the Bible. And that was supposed to be your day of rest. It was just a really...
They went to church for how long?
Like 8 hours.
It would just be one like continuous...
that would, like a sermon could last,
Wow.
like 8 hours. In November of 1689, a man named Samuel Parris is named the new minister of Salem, and he moves to Salem from Boston. Now, there was a lot of drama in Salem, just really in general. But one of the things that was dramatic was that there was Salem town, which is the same today.
Right.
And then there was kind of this subset of Salem town called Salem Village.
Okay.
Now, Salem Village, long story short, ends up being where a lot of these events occurred and is now it has since changed to be called Danvers, Massachusetts.
Okay.
So it's the Salem Witch Trials, but they happened in Salem and Danvers. Also a little bit of Boston in there. You know what I'm saying? You got to sprinkle a little of that Boston in.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? There was drama already for that reason. There was also drama between a lot of the townspeople because everyone was always watching each other.
Okay.
And they really were watching each other because that was kind of a part of the deal of being a Puritan.
Right.
So Samuel Parris, the job he walked into was already tough. And some people were liking him, some people weren't liking him. Kind of a lot of that, just like nitpicky, exactly. Yeah. A lot of just issues. Some of the issue that kind of came about between Samuel Parris, the new minister in Salem, and some of the other people that were living in the community. The people, or at least the more normal people, that, maybe the people that weren't super, super wealthy. They knew that they were intimidated, maybe, of the minister, but it was kind of an unclear delineation of who worked for who. it wasn't really exactly sure, and it kind of depended on who you were talking to at what time and what they kind of thought.
Meaning everyone kind of worked for the Reverend?
So it's kind of strange. Life back then was just so different that it's sometimes even kind of difficult for me to wrap my head around. Like, so the minister in the town was honestly kind of like the daddy, of the town. But at the same way, he relied on the people of the town. For example, like the people really relied on him for they all took their spirituality so seriously, and they, revered him and took his and wanted to have a highly spiritual, intelligent, wise man, and they wanted someone that they could really follow.
Right.
But at the same time, Paris and also the ministers for a town in general would rely on other people in the town to maybe chop firewood, or just to even be paid. And sometimes the town just wouldn't pay, or the town wouldn't bring these materials that they were supposed to do, and it would cause the minister, that could be one of the highest ranking people in the town, to resort to begging the people to finally give in. So it's this kind of weird power dynamic, especially because Puritans are absolutely obsessed with class and with the hierarchy.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's something I didn't know about. That they were simultaneously so revered, yet kind of...
The people would make it known if they did not like their minister. They were very open about their opinions.
Interesting.
And that's something that I think also it gets a little warped when people talk about Salem, is that you think that everyone is so quiet and that there are no skeptics in the society.
Right.
When really there were.
Right.
Before and during. But
that's
right now we're talking about before. But yeah, there were.
That's a very good point. That's a good thing to highlight, because I think we it's so easy to think that it was just the whole town was batshit. The whole, you know what I mean? No, obviously, like with anything, there's varying levels. And yeah, that's interesting about how it's like they're more loyal to the position of minister than the person filling that role.
Exactly. The person filling that role, it really depends on the person.
Right. It has nothing to do with their faith in the church or the message. It's that person filling the role.
Yes, but it could be it's usually they didn't like the way that person was preaching or was fulfilling their duties as a minister. Like, these people were were so invested in their spiritual life, and they felt that the way that they were guided by their minister was of the utmost importance, and that it was worth calling out and worth complaining about. And also, a lot of the people, including the ministers, were actually very highly educated and trained. Not necessarily everyone, not everyone in the town was able to do that, but a lot of the people that are involved in this case were Harvard educated people. Harvard was new at the time, but I think even then people were like, this is exciting.
Yeah, I was just going to say Harvard would have been, 1636.
Yeah, so she's fresh.
So that's a fresh college.
She's a fresh school.
That's a fresh school.
She hasn't had her drunk nights at Taco Bell yet.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, she hasn't woken up crying yet. So even though there was a high level of education, at this point there had not been a university-trained doctor in Salem. They did have a medical kit, but it contained beetle's blood, fox lung, and dried dolphin heart.
Okay, so that must have been like that day's aspirin?
Yeah.
So they had some aspirin, some Pepto.
Basically what I'm trying to tell you is...
a Tums.
These people didn't know a ton in terms of like biology and like anatomy.
Did you say beetle blood?
Yeah. And I understand that maybe getting a dolphin heart makes it seem like you do know anatomy. What I just am saying is like they might not have the hardest, firmest grasp on like knowing if someone is... You'll get it,
Wouldn't see any of these folks on an episode of ER.
That's right, okay?
So
by October 16th, 1691, the people of Salem Village were just pissed with Paris because people are fussy, and they were like, we're not going to pay your salary until like we don't feel like what you're doing is working. Then on January 20th, 1692, 9-year-old Elizabeth Paris, who is Samuel Paris's daughter,
right,
and his niece and also servant. This shit kind of happened sometimes where you had people that were like your niece, but they also worked for you.
Oh, so she was blood related, like she was actual family, but was also like a servant?
Yes. So 9-year-old Elizabeth Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, they started acting super, super weird. Like they were kind of convulsing about and acting very similarly to the way that these children named the Goodwin children had acted a few years before. And that was the last witchcraft case that was in Salem.
Interesting. But for whatever reason, that one did not catch fire the way.
That one did not catch fire as much. In fact, there were witch trials throughout Massachusetts history.
Right.
But before the Salem Witch Trials, only 6 women had hanged for witchcraft.
Interesting. Okay.
So there had been talks of witchcraft before, and it didn't become a whole town hysteria thing.
Right.
So these girls started acting similarly. And the way that I believe what kind of sparked the idea in these girls' mind, this is also so weird and illogical and doesn't line up, and it'll come again later too, but like the Puritans did kind of have this like fascination with fortune telling and things like that. Maybe because they believed in predetermination, they were so fascinated by what their future held. But so these 2 girls, they did this thing where they cracked an egg, and then they would see what the color of what the shape of the egg white kind of looked like.
Right.
It would say something about your future husband or something.
Right. And that's another thing a lot of people don't realize. Something I didn't even realize till the last few years, when we really started studying this stuff, is that magic and ritual is a very big part of the founding of, like, it was very common for farmers of the time to practice magic because, if your crops didn't make it, that could be a death sentence. That could literally be the end of your life. And this is not, it's so funny that as devout and as ferocious as their faith was, it kind of by proxy also increased their belief in things they didn't like, their fear of things. Because of their devout belief, their fear of other things also increased.
Totally. Yeah, there's a quote in this book that says their environment and where they were in, along with their fear of the devil and their certainty that the end was coming. That is just breeding ground for belief in both the sacred and the occult.
Right.
And the Puritans were always so anti-witchcraft.
Right.
But there were certain things that they didn't really view as witchcraft.
Yeah.
Because it's not, but it's interesting what seemed acceptable and what didn't seem acceptable.
Because
and also,
sometimes the dumbest thing would to them would be such a great offense.
Right, totally.
And then sometimes there'd be things you'd hear and you'd be like, well, why didn't that, like, why was this okay?
Right.
If the other wasn't. Not that it was bad. It's just like, well, if the other thing was not okay.
And I think some of that kind of changed a little bit, like, after the trials, too.
Right. Well, and you got to, like we were saying, these are people that they've come from the other side of the ocean. They're terrified.
Yeah.
They're living in a very unforgiving environment. Mm-hmm. They're probably clinging to their faith. Like, honestly, if a lot of us were in their shoes back then, we would probably be we'd probably be there for 10 hours every fucking Sunday praying our hearts out because you didn't have control over almost anything. You really didn't.
Exactly.
You literally, the only thing you had any sort of control over were the people in your children. If you were a parent, the only thing you could really control was your children.
Exactly.
And so when your children start acting fucking crazy, then you've lost all control.
Yes. And that's what these 2 girls were doing. They did this thing where they cracked an egg and, they wanted to learn about their future husband, which I just think is so funny. I mean, like, times have not changed. I did that stuff constantly growing up too. Not obviously with like a fucking egg.
And there's like a million different versions of core. Like there's the mirror one.
But these 2 girls, they're trying to, doing this thing. And the egg white seems to them to take the shape of a coffin. And that really freaked them out. Did that open the door for some sort of diabolical, demonic forces to enter the home? Or were the girls freaked out because they saw something that, resembled death and that scared them?
Right.
And it kind of led to these girls acting out and being crazy? I don't know, but that's the question. In February, so the next month, a man named Dr. Griggs comes in and he checks in on the girls, and he said that they're physically seem to be fine, but they are afflicted by witchcraft, and he believes that witchcraft is the reason for the strange behavior. So then on February 25th, 1692, an enslaved woman working for the Paris household, her name was Tituba, and Tituba was requested to bake something called a witch cake. A witch cake is basically where you take the pee, the urine of these afflicted girls, and you make a cake out of it. You cook it, and then you feed it to the dog. The idea is that this will let you know if the afflicted people are bewitched or not, and also that if you feed it to the dog, that the evil spirit will exit your urine and go to the dog, because dogs is believed to be a familiar of the devil. Familiars are going to come up. I think we've talked about familiars.
I think we've mentioned familiars in the past, but yes, a very big, large facet of witchcraft as a whole.
But when it is found out that Tituba has made this witch cake, there really is a huge uproar.
Right.
Some people did know about the affliction that these two girls were going through, because it is a small town and things get out, and the Paris family had been trying to help the girls. So they had, let some people know about it. But anyway, once the word came out that Tituba made this witch cake, that seemed like it went too far.
Who asked Tituba to make this witch cake again?
A neighbor named Mary Sibley. She thought that would be a good idea.
Did Mary Sibley ever come over and be oh, actually, it was me that asked her to?
Oh, well, she, died.
I want to see Paul Hollywood try a witch cake.
Oh my God, yeah. So eventually these two girls come forward and they say, yes, we have been bewitched. Tituba had known Samuel Paris for a long time. Samuel Paris earlier had actually lived in Barbados. It seems like Tituba knew Samuel Paris in Barbados and possibly was even an enslaved worker for him. And Paris saw something interesting in Barbados. And there was something that will come back up later that will remind you of this, but when he was in Barbados, the white people obviously were the ones that were in power.
Right.
But the white people were outnumbered by the enslaved people by, I don't know the exact number, but a wild amount. And there was a lot of fear among the white slave owners and just the white people in general that there was going to be a revolt, because this is just what happens. Finally, people are like, wait, there's more of us than there are of you. We don't need to do this. Before anything, really happened, Samuel Paris left and Tituba joined him. Tituba had been a member of this family in a way, because that she ate food with them every day. She was around every day when they would read the Bible together. She went to church as well. This was a person that was very much involved in this family's life. But the girls, eventually, Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Paris, after being pressured by ministers and townspeople, they say that Tituba is a witch and was tormenting them. Okay. Later, they also named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. They were other women that lived in the town. They both were a little bit more down and out, poor people that were a little bit more of outcasts of society. So the three of these people kind of made sense.
Right.
Everyone was like, okay, these are the kind of people that I would think would be
right.
a witch. What the Puritans considered to be a witch was a little muddied, but this is what they overall thought.
A witch is one who can do or seems to do strange things beyond the known power of art and ordinary nature, by virtue of a confederacy with evil spirits.
They also knew witches to transform into cats, wolves, rabbits. They knew that witches had a fondness for yellow birds, and toads were a sign of witches. They also knew that witches had familiars, and that they had something called a witch's mark, which is essentially like a little teat on your body where your familiar suckles from. It's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard.
So it doesn't suckle from one of your existing teats.
Right. Well, that will come up again later too, but it seems for the most part, no, they suckle from their own whatever, with your witch's mark. But it could look like anything. And that's kind of the issue, is that it's like any irregular
Right,
spot.
of course, which almost
Could
everyone
be
has
anything.
something. Right.
So arrest warrants go out for the women, and they are brought to Boston Prison. Boston Prison was, at the time, a very, very bleak place to be. Very cold, damp, very unsanitary, lice all around. It was a really, really rough place to be. But then on March 1st, they began the trial against these women. Basically, they did this thing called the touch test, which was these afflicted girls would be freaking out, convulsing all over the place. And the idea was, if the witch who put this upon her touched her, then the convulsing would stop.
Sounds foolproof.
Just will always work.
I know how to settle this.
So they employed that, and of course that worked. Also, I kind of was saying this before, trials weren't the way that we think they are today. There weren't really like lawyers. It was super loud in there. People could kind of just like shout out things. Was by no means an innocent until proven guilty thing.
Right.
It was guilty. You're guilty, probably.
Right.
So Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good, they are brought forth and they are questioned. Essentially, they say they haven't done anything wrong. They are not witches. They don't know anything about being a witch. Then Titchy walks forward. Keep in mind, Titchy kind of knows the name of the game. Okay, she's seen some shit in Barbados.
Right.
She's been like on the sidelines, like watching like a hawk during her time in Salem. And she's like, hold on. If I deny, I'm fucked.
Right.
So she took a different route.
Okay.
She said previously that she had ran into a white-haired man, and he ordered her to hurt the children. And with him, there were 4 accomplices, including Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and some other Bostonians. So she was able to answer all of these questions. And in all of the questionings, some other names were named in terms of other witches. Then on March 11th, Ann Putnam Jr., another girl about town, started showing afflictions of witchcraft. Okay. So did Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Mary Warren. They later said that they were experiencing pinches or biting, prodding, and just these like intense convulsions where they were not in control of their body whatsoever.
Okay.
And in the days to come, a few people would be named as witches. 2 of them that maybe were of the highest accord were Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse. Now, especially Rebecca Nurse was known as someone to be very pious, godly woman, well known throughout the town.
Right.
So this was a little bit different than before, when Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba were named.
Right.
These seemed like witches to them. Now these were people that the town wasn't expecting. And these people were confused, obviously, about why this was all happening in this town full of godly people. But at the same time, it actually did make sense. From the book The Witches, I'll quote, "Where will the devil show most malice but where he is hated, and hateth most?" Mather demanded. "The devil's appearance was nearly a badge of honor, further proof that New Englanders were the chosen people." Martha Corey was one of these newest women that was accused of witchcraft. However, at this point, she didn't know it. One morning, though, 2 gentlemen named Putnam and Cheever came to check in with her, and before they could even sit down, she said, "I know what you are come for. You are come to talk to me about being a witch." which is true, but it's not a good look if people are kind of casting aspersions. Maybe don't make it seem like you knew the future. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So she did that. And they were like, well, yeah, that is true. And then Martha Corey, she was prepared. She knew that there was a chance of this happening because she knew this was kind of beginning. And she says, but did she tell you what clothes I have on? Now, before these two men, Putnam and Cheever, had left, they had asked Ann Putnam Jr., who was the girl who said that Martha Corey was guilty of witchcraft. They asked her if they knew what Martha Corey was wearing, because that would prove that she actually saw Martha Corey's actual self, whether that's her specter, her ghost, or herself. So the fact that Martha Corey was able to ask that question was not a good look, was bad.
Right.
Again, because they were like, couldn't believe it. Really, this was a question that was asked before. Like, this wasn't like an insane thing for her to just guess.
Right.
And once again, she wasn't even trying to guess. It was just a coincidence. However, there was really no such thing as a coincidence to the Puritans. They thought every single thing was a sign.
Of course.
So Martha Corey was like, you guys, this is enough. I'm not a witch. So 2 days later, Martha Corey goes to the Putnam household. She's going to go there. She's like, listen, I'm so sure that like Ann Putnam Jr. has me confused for someone else. Like, this just must be a case of mistaken identity. And I'm going to go and I'm going to clear this up. As soon as she entered the house, Anne started to choke. In a strangled voice, she said that it was Martha Corey who was doing this to her, and that her hands and her feet were twisting. Finally, she was able to speak, and she said that she could see a yellow canary suckling between Corey's second and third fingers. Then the Putnam's nurse, Mercy Lewis, walked in. It was an absolute nightmare. There was even issues about, they were worried about them falling into the fire. Some people reported that there were bite marks all along Mercy's skin. But long story short, it got so bad that they had to tell Martha Corey to get out of the house. Like, she was making this so bad that she needed to leave. So once again, that also was not great.
That has to be the most frustrating when you know when you know you're not doing anything.
Like, I'm not doing anything.
But you know that but people are like fucking buying into it.
And that is what's so weird. In this society, it is all about order, all about status. The people in the society that you usually trust are the ones that are being called out by the people in the lowest really places of society. Servants were accusing their bosses, siblings accusing siblings, children accusing adults, and these adolescents, especially these adolescent girls, were being listened to and were also getting attention, and were actually able to make a difference and to have their voices be heard.
I think the great irony is this society that is supposed to have men at the head of it got walked all over by the kids.
Right.
That's the great irony. The men were supposed to be the ones in control when the kids just took everyone for a fucking ride.
Exactly. And it wasn't necessarily that the kids even took them for a ride and that they knew what they were doing. Right. Like, everyone just bought into everything. It was just so wrapped up, and everyone got each other all riled up. Now, just because some of these women were sent to jail didn't mean that they stopped their spectral activity.
Can't keep them down.
For example, this is a description of an account of what some people claim to have happened to them after a day at court for Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse. While the afflicted saw nothing further that day of Martha Corey, they enjoyed little peace. Ann Putnam Sr. woke the next morning to a visitor. At dawn, Rebecca Nurse pounced upon her, dressed only in a linen garment. She carried a little red book. For 2 hours the women wrestled, Nurse denying the power of God and Christ, and threatening to wrench Ann's soul from her body. Meanwhile, the beggar Sarah Good's 5-year-old daughter flew about the village, sinking her teeth into Mary Walcott and Ann Putnam Jr. Both displayed raw imprints of her miniature mouth. With a glance, tiny Dorothy Good sent the girls into crippling spasms. She choked and pinched them, goading them to write in the Devil's Book, of which suddenly there was a profusion in Salem Village. So people were saying shit was going on.
It was popping.
It was kind of popping.
It was the place to be. Mm-hmm. It was the Austin of 1692.
Oh my God, it was. It was so cool. I hope it stays cool, you know?
Yeah. Keep Salem weird.
Keep Salem weird.
I wonder if they had...
Keep Salem pious.
Keep Salem pious.
Should we make Keep Salem pious t-shirts?
I think that would be a great... Creep Street podcast, Keep Salem pious.
Keep Salem pious.
I think it's an option.
Now, she wasn't the only accused witch to have been apparently seen spectrally, at least, after her imprisonment. Another accused witch named Bridget Bishop also made a lot of these evening visits. Apparently, in April, the Salem Marshal had cited a nocturnal visit. The June jury heard of at least 5 more. Bishop seemed to have a habit of hopping around young men's bedrooms, incapacitating them and striking them dumb, symptoms commonly associated with a different form of enchantment. Wanton or flirtatious, she burned bright in men's minds. They tended to recall her wardrobe precisely. Then on April 11th, 1692, things changed a little bit. On April 11th, John Proctor was the first man to be accused and incarcerated of witchcraft. Now, historically speaking, men actually usually fare worse in terms of being convicted and executed for witchcraft. Women are much more likely to be accused of witchcraft.
Right.
But I guess the criminal justice system could be harder on the men at the time, which is interesting because that doesn't really seem even possible.
Right.
It's like, it's all bad, you know?
That's interesting.
It's like, throughout April, lots of different people have been called out or accused of witchcraft. Especially there are these 8 girls that have kind of pulled themselves together into the forefront. These 8 girls that are afflicted or bewitched. And they're kind of like the bloodhounds or the soothsayers or kind of like, they really are like kind of like bloodhounds. They would either use them in the court or sometimes even outside of the court. They would bring the girls to certain houses or certain places to see if they would react to what was happening. And then finally on April 30th, former Salem minister George Burroughs is named. Now, George Burroughs is like, you know, a big man on campus. This was a big deal that he was named. And he even was a former preacher in Salem. He used to preach in the meeting house 3 times weekly for 2 years. Mm-hmm. So he really knew the place he was walking back into. He knew the meeting house where he was going to be. I mean, it makes sense that these girls would call on him.
Right.
Because he's kind of like a huge hierarchical figure kind of for them, and one that they were familiar with. And that is something that some skeptics would call out later. They would say, like, isn't it interesting that all of these witches that you were seeing for the most part are people you know? Right. That's kind of an interesting thing. But so George Burroughs has been spending time before now in Maine. In fact, he had just survived this like insane attack in Maine. He is coming fresh off of that. Also, ministers really were not seriously tried for crimes like this that just really didn't really happen in the past. And also, he formerly was a preacher in Salem, so he kind of like came into it being like, hey, not really too worried about the situation. However, there were things about him that did not really seem right. For example, Burroughs made his wife sign like a primitive NDA, basically.
Interesting. Okay.
Which was odd, especially for the time, for your wife to sign something about being so secretive. So May 7th, George Burroughs is brought back to Salem, and shortly thereafter, he is put in jail. And he is brought to Boston jail. We had talked about this a little bit before, but I just want to I really want you guys to understand how fucking terrible Boston jail was. It was known as the suburb of hell, and you could smell the prison from way far off from when you're approaching it because of the sewage and the rotting, festering wounds.
Oh.
Every person, or at least the witches, the accused witches, were shackled by their feet and their wrists. And the shackles sometimes were so heavy that people were having seizures and convulsions. Ugh. It, as you can imagine, would get insanely cold there. It was so cold that one person in 1685 had sent a horse thief to Barbados to serve their sentence there because they were worried that this horse thief, was going to freeze to death in the Boston jail. No such niceties were offered for the women and the people that were accused of being witches. So there he was, Burroughs. He thought he was good to go. He was there in this jail. Also, prisoners had to pay their own way in the prison. They had to pay a room and board type of fee. Right. And if they didn't pay it, then they would not, that could possibly keep them from being released from prison when they finally can. Wow. People really survived by just scraps of food that family members were able to pass through the bars. And the prison was also designed for more of a short stay type situation. These cells were essentially just rooms, stone walls, dirt floors, and sometimes maybe a chamber pot. So the people that were in there for months and months and months at a time, this was really, they were just really descending further and further, and their health was just it's just impossible. You cannot, I can't even imagine living in those kinds of conditions. And there's kind of some confusion between New England and Old England about charters and what was allowed and what wasn't allowed and who was in charge and blah, blah, blah. So the trials took a lot longer to get going than they really should have. And that's what caused this huge backup in the system, basically, where there were all of these people being held in prison because they were accused of a capital offense, but it took so long for them to be, in trial. So there's all of these innocent people spending, months and months and months in jail in these really horrific conditions. There were also a lot of other women that were accused of witchcraft that came forward and said that they did things themselves. Okay. Maybe that there was a little bit of a dirty little devil man going around the town. Some people, they were even talking about these big old meetings that people were having. Maybe even some dark baptisms.
Okay.
Some meetings, some get-togethers. And Dylan, I would just love it if you would tell the people a little bit about what maybe these diabolical meetings were all about.
2 months earlier, when most of Salem Village had occupied itself with sheep shearing, with churning sweet spring milk into butter, with sowing Indian corn, a great swarm of witches had alighted in Paris's brilliantly green meadow. You might have heard the trumpet that summoned them. It resonated for miles around. The beating of a drum and a great commotion followed from as far away as Connecticut. Over the course of hours, in a rustle of arrivals, witches descended on the village by every manner of aerial transport. Not all of them could say precisely how they swept into Salem. The Andover witches arrived in a matter of minutes. Mary Lacey Sr., of course, sailed on the ill-designed stick with her mother and Martha Carrier. Richard Carrier did not recall the date of the assembly, but his memory refreshed, conceded that he had flown to the village with Mary Lacey Jr. They did so on an unwieldy contraption, assuming the shape of a horse. The devil carried the teenagers on a pole balanced across his shoulders. One farmer traveled alone on a branch. Most flew 3 or 4 to a pole. Ann Foster and Martha Carrier's picnic had preceded that flurry. Others from the Andover contingent joined them. Foster counted only 25 witches. Richard Carrier reported they numbered about 70 in all. Mary Lacey Jr. estimated the attendance at 100. the devil appeared in the shape of a black man with a high-crowned hat, another Swedish import. One celebrant noted a cloven foot. The witches indulged in a satanic ceremony all the more subversive as women officiated. Rebecca Nurse sat at the head of the communion table, at the devil's side. With an incantation, she and Elizabeth Proctor handed around crimson-colored wine and bread. Nurse assured Abigail Hobbs that the wine was blood, and better than our wine. Paris's niece confirmed that she saw the celebrants eat and drink. What was it they served? They said it was our blood, and they had it twice a day, she testified, adding a vampiric twist. As for the bread, it was as red as raw flesh. One participant watched Martha Carrier pour the wine. Mary Lacey Jr. recalled that there had not been enough bread to go around. Some had been reduced to stealing provisions, while others, like her grandmother, had brought their own. Not everyone partook. Even at a satanic congress, there were pockets of resistance, despite the phalanx of 105 spectral swordsmen stationed nearby. 16-year-old Andrew Carrier drank from an earthenware cup, but did not eat. He was too far away to hear what the devil said when administering his sacrament. Abigail refused the sweet bread and wine. Her mother passed up a tankard. Ann Foster kept her distance. A particularly disobliging recruit, Mercy Lewis, spat at those who offered the bread. "I will have none of it," she howled. Some who accepted the drink found it bitter. Reverend Burroughs officiated over the sacrament in the presence of 2 other men. Despite repeated interrogations, no one could identify them, although at least one of them was a minister.
So this is a story that has kind of been pieced together from a lot of different accounts of this evening. It's funny because it's like these women and men and children, you know, when they were asked these questions and they would answer in such fantastical ways.
Right.
It's kind of for a few different reasons. One reason is they genuinely believed in the devil so much.
Right.
And there was so much confusion as to who the devil was and where the devil was and what he could do and what he was capable of. And there was so much uncertainty in the devil that people start to think maybe he is a part of me. Maybe I am under his realm. You know,
start to believe. Right.
You believe like if anything could be the enemy, like why wouldn't it be me?
Right.
Maybe the devil was able to convince me or to warp my memory.
Right.
So I don't even know that I'm doing these things.
Right.
So one part of it is that they could have really convinced themselves that they had truly done something or that they had seen something or whatever. But some of the time also was they knew, because it was outright told to them, that if you confess to doing this, and especially if you name other names, they're not going to kill you.
Right.
They're not going to execute you. For now, they're keeping you alive. They haven't really decided what they're doing yet.
Right.
It's the women and the people who wouldn't confess were the ones that were getting executed. But as we said before, these people are so devout and they believe so hard in their faith that a lot of these people cannot even imagine lying under oath.
Right, exactly.
They can't lie. And the way that these trials were started, the judge or whoever was leading would say, "Culprit, how will you be tried?" And the person needed to respond by God and by country. And their God was everything in this new country. New England was also kind of supposed to be like this new Israel, like their whole world. So a lot of these people were not willing to say they were a witch because they genuinely weren't, and they felt like they couldn't lie. This problem is really growing faster and faster. And it really was like when you implicated one person, it was kind of the whole family would be slowly but surely implicated around them. So I believe the number is 5 accused witches for March and 25 by April.
Wow.
So things are just really, really escalating and going quickly. And it is in July 19th. That is the day that Rebecca Nurse, as well as some other accused witches, including Sarah Good, they were hanged at Gallows Hill.
These were the first ones of this. Okay.
Yes.
So they were the first victims of the Salem Witch Trials.
Yes. So they're not the first people to be hanged. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop was hanged, but Rebecca Nurse being hanged really had like a really big effect on the community.
Right.
Kind of seeing this woman that so many people knew and respected was kind of a big thing to happen, and it really shook a lot of people. As the rest of the summer went by, unfortunately, there was just more trials and more accusations. Now, there are so many people in this case, and so many people that were both accused and survived and accused and executed that are so interesting. I wish I could just like talk about everything. I really wish I could just like read this book aloud to you.
Right.
I really encourage you to read this book, because there are so many very interesting stories. But we now are going to focus on the experience of a man named Giles Corey.
Yes.
Now, you may remember the name Corey from before. Martha Corey was one of the first women to be accused of witchcraft. She was the woman that went over to the young girl's house. She was sure that there was some sort of mistake, went there, and the girl went, batshit.
Right.
It really backfired on her. So this is her husband, Giles Corey. Giles Corey himself did not have a great reputation. He had kind of a scandalous past, which is what Martha Corey did as well. She actually had a child out of wedlock before. I mean, hello, crazy.
Boy.
It was believed actually that Giles Corey had killed someone, I believe. So he had his own past. He really had seen enough. He knew that there was no chance for a fair trial. He was really up against it. So when he was forced to go to trial, he was asked, "Culprit, how will you be tried?" And he just wouldn't respond. And the trial could not continue until he said, "By God and by country." And so he just wouldn't say it. And everyone was like trying to get him to say it, and it was like such like everyone was, pissed. I mean, like he really kind of like nailed it. I gotta like give it to him on that one.
Right.
In terms of like finding little loopholes.
Found a little legal loophole there.
Right. And now remember, you guys, we're in New England, okay? New England at this time was not above using torture. For example, they used this device in the prison where they would use this board and a rope to kind of behind their legs. The woman's leg is behind their head as well, to kind of keep them in this arched position for long periods of time. That was very painful. And also, they decided that they really wanted to make a point with Giles Corey. And they told him that they were going to try to do this old form of execution, and I believe it's called Pien forte et dure. I'm not exactly sure how you say. I literally have no idea. Sorry, Group Street. Which is essentially when you lay down and a board is put on top of you, and stones are put on top of you, and you are just slowly pressed to death. It's brutal. But Giles Corey decided that he would rather die than to be falsely charged and put through this court system that was unfair. And here is an account of what happened.
Probably on September 17th, guards led Corey either to the enclosed Salem prison yard or across the street to a field. He removed his shoes and stripped to near nakedness before stretching out spread eagle on the cool ground. Officials covered him with a plank, on which they piled rocks. Downton, the overemployed jail keep, presumably assisted. The authorities worked directly from established legal code. It called for a defendant to be pressed under as great a weight as he could bear and more. Corey was to, quote, have no sustenance, save only, on the first day, 3 morsels of the worst bread, and, on the second day, 3 draughts of standing water. That should be nearest to the prison door. In its earliest hours, the torture could yield results. After a certain point, it was too late. Spectators clustered around, among them a friend of Corey's, a prosperous, truculent Nantucket sea captain. Salem-born, he had served as a selectman He understood the situation as well as the odds. A brother-in-law counted among the fugitives. He attempted to reason with Corey. In the last moments of his multiple-day ordeal, his tongue protruded from his mouth. Evidently, Sheriff Corwin, with his cane, forced it in again. The old man expired soon after, at about noon on September 19th.
So yes, that is a very gruesome death of Giles Corey.
Gave him the worst bread.
Yeah, the worst bread. Also, his wife was still in the prison, I believe. She was able to, this is bad, this is hard, but hear, the groans of her husband as he was dying, and she was just laying, shackled in this prison. I mean, this is bad. This is dark.
This is bad.
And it was partially the intensity and the severity of what happened to Giles Corey, as well as some eyes coming in from outside. People in Old England, when they started to hear about this, were appalled.
Right.
As well as just people that were the Quakers that were living nearby, all these people, the Dutch that were living nearby, they couldn't believe what was happening. And then also there are some people, I think, within themselves kind of starting to have these doubts. And it's like,
right.
These are the times when this really reminds me so much of a cult.
Right.
And I mean, that's kind of what this was. It was essentially, Salem Village was a cult.
Right.
And it got absolutely wound up out, and it got completely out of control. There are some similarities that you see between the two, at least I think. And it's really kind of eye-opening to see how people can just get wrapped up into things, but then once, for whatever, it doesn't work always right away. Sometimes, there are the people that were accused that were saying they were innocent. No one was believing them, but
right.
I don't know. It just something about it. It's like the people finally, enough was enough. And I think maybe just the numbers kind of started to they were like, what are the chances that all of these people are in direct correspondence with the devil?
Exactly.
Maybe this is getting a little out of hand. So these outside pressures, the Giles Corey case, and as well as the execution of George Burroughs. Now this goes back a couple months. So just stepping back quickly to August 19th. This was the day that George Burroughs was hanged on Gallows Hill.
Right.
When he went up there, he gave, this impassioned speech about his innocence through the end. And also when he was in prison, there were people that came to him and said that they had lied and they were begging for forgiveness, because these people had just outright lied about him, and he was very saintly about it, gracious, and accepted their apology and forgave them. And right before he was to hang, he was able to recite all of the Lord's Prayer out loud.
Right.
Which was believed that a witch or a wizard could not do.
Right.
So he did it. So everyone was already sad because of this impassioned speech. And then everyone was like, wait, well, he did the thing. We thought that was kind of the whole deal. And then they were like, no. The devil can, do whatever, can make this happen. Convinces them. And he is still hanged. But so even though George Burroughs was still hanged, that moment also did really kind of start to open up the idea for people.
Right.
Also, spectral evidence was something that was really used and was essential for a lot of the cases. Spectral evidence is basically like what it sounds like. It's
right.
like those, when the girls, they're like, can't you see, there's a bird that's flying above there, but no one else can see anything.
Right.
That stuff. They were using that as evidence before, but they should not have been, because it's not provable, obviously. And people were also kind of starting to realize, mainly from the help of a man named Thomas Brattle. He was the youngest of the witchcraft judges. He came in later, and he just wrote this really interesting book about how this doesn't necessarily make any sense.
Right.
Maybe there are people that can see the spectral world, but what are the chances that all of these girls have it?
Right.
And just how spectral evidence doesn't have any sort of place in justice.
Right.
And so once that idea was adopted, it made the cases completely null and void, essentially, because that was all that a lot of these cases were based on.
Right.
That also change things. And then, so slowly but surely, people started being released from prison. Like I was saying before, like people had to pay their own way through prisons.
Right.
So Samuel Paris, at the end of the day, he did not want to pay for Tituba's fees in the jail. So even though Tituba, she confessed early on, and then it was obviously clear that no one was doing anything. So she was just staying in jail. But someone, the name is unknown, paid all of her jail costs in 1693. But unfortunately, that was effectively buying her.
Oh, I see.
So what we do know is that she left Massachusetts. And this really just ended up being a huge, embarrassing mark on the history of Massachusetts and New England in general. I mean, people for a long time really didn't want to, that lived in the area, still didn't even really want to like talk about it. Arthur Miller said that when he was researching for The Crucible, that it was like impossible to get anyone to like talk to him about it that was there. At the time, people still didn't want that association connected with it. But something that did kind of help the people move on and cope, I guess, they got a new minister named Joseph Green, and he really focused on trying to kind of like heal from that. He reseated the where people would sit in services and in meetings. A daughter of Rebecca Nurse was sat beside her accuser's mother, things like that. Also, a lot of people came forward and made like, you know, these public apologies saying that they were sorry or that they lied and that they regret what they did. Some people, you know, some of the higher ups and the judges in this story did not necessarily feel that way. They did not admit to any wrongdoing necessarily, but just that they agreed that it should not be that way ever again. For the people that survived, it was really hard. I mean, the town really suffered from this. I mean, there were a lot of orphans and also just so many women being away for so long. That's so much labor that they didn't have that they could have used. So they, you know, they didn't get as much done in terms of farming or chopping wood or, you know, any of these things. So everyone really kind of suffered from this. So it was a big deal. But the thing that's so interesting, the trials completely backfired. Because people were able to see how warped things could be and how a religion could be, there was way more, people became more open to different kind of thoughts necessarily. There were more atheists than there were before. And people, you know, things changed. People started celebrating Christmas in the coming years, which they weren't doing at the time. Just things started to really loosen up. But the area really wanted to kind of cover this up because they felt embarrassed by what had happened. But the thing is, a lot of people actually descend from these families or from this time. There are a few American presidents that descend from George Jacobs, which was a man that was accused. Also, Louisa May Alcott is descended from a man named Samuel Sewall. We didn't get into a ton about him specifically, but he's a big player. Walt Disney descended from George Burroughs.
Oh, wow.
Rebecca Nurse, her family includes Lucille Ball.
Interesting.
Which, this is very, very interesting. Lucille Ball, a member of the Nurse family, before an investigator from the House of Un-American Activities Committee, because this was during McCarthyism. So, where she did say that she had registered with the Communist Party, but no, she was not a communist. And in 1953, Desi Arnaz said that the only thing red about Lucy is her hair. And even that's not legitimate. So it just runs in the family for Lucy to be kind of dealing with these witch hunts, Lucille Ball.
Interesting.
I know. I was like, wait a minute, I love this. Something that kind of changed the mind of popular culture in general, but as well as just the community of Danvers and Salem, was actually the show Bewitched.
Oh, really?
And also just kind of the idea that they were like, oh, wait, we can actually kind of make this like a cute thing.
Right.
Like enough time has gone by, like this is like fun.
Right.
So since then, things have changed, and I think the area has kind of leaned more into the vibe.
I think it's a big part of the...
Yes.
Right.
Which I love. I think that's great. Let's honor that. Let's remember it.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to drive there possibly.
In November. So if we do, we'll definitely take pictures. Absolutely.
But, one last thing. It wasn't until Halloween of 2001 that Massachusetts finally pardoned the last of the witches.
Really?
From the Salem Witch Trials. Yes. Isn't that crazy? It took until 2001.
Wow, that's wild.
Yes. But now let's talk about the causes of this.
Yes.
Because kind of like we said before, things like this had happened in the past, and just full-on witch hunts aside, just there had been claims of witchcraft and people had said to have seen witchcraft or been bewitched in the past, and this didn't happen. This whole blow up didn't happen.
Exactly.
So a part of that, I think, kind of like what we had talked about, is the idea of groupthink and and also I think something is really to be said too about false confessions, which we had talked about before. A lot of these people came forward and confessed because they knew that it was the only way they could survive.
Right.
Some people confessed because they really were convinced by the judges and by the townsfolk that they actually did do this and they just weren't aware.
It sounds silly, but if you are in a position where everyone in the town, especially back then, is telling you are responsible for something, even if you don't think you are, after a while, part of you is going to be like, well, what if they're right? I mean, if the devil is the ultimate trickster, maybe I am. Maybe he did trick. So it ends up becoming a self-damning thing.
Especially with these really high-ranking and important men that are telling you over and over and over again what happened or what didn't happen, and then you're spending all of this time in jail ruminating on that. It makes sense. And also because the Puritans were so obsessed with rank and order, and they did not believe that everyone was equal. They did not believe that.
Right.
And so when someone ahead of their station or whatever is saying these things to them, it's really kind of bred in them to believe it and to go on with it and to kind of think badly about yourself.
Right.
So these aspects are totally true, and I think they cause a huge factor. Or they played a huge role in this.
Right.
But an interesting different idea. This one I'm very into.
This is very interesting. And I think I heard this popped up around 1975, they think, was when this theory... This is a fun theory, and it's a theory we've touched on a little bit. We've touched on a few times, in Rendlesham and a few others.
Yeah. So what seems like happened was these people accidentally got fucking high.
High?
Yeah, they got high, honey. They got high. You know what I'm saying?
So explain how this could have happened.
I would just love to explain how this happened. There is a fungus called ergot or egot. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it.
I don't know either. I feel like I've heard it said called egot and ergot. So I don't know. So we'll just,
I'm going to say ergot.
Sure. For the sake of this, obviously, if there's someone out there who knows better than us, we apologize.
Just reading's hard, you know?
Yeah, know what I mean?
And English doesn't make any sense. So, ergot is this fungus that grows on rye. And basically, this fungus would really, really thrive after a very, very cold winter and then going into a wet spring. And that's exactly what happened.
Right.
Salem. Right. Also, sometimes the color, the fungus that would be on the rye would affect the color of the rye, but the people just assumed that it was different coloration on the rye due to sun exposure and things like that.
Right.
So even the Dr. Griggs, who came in, he didn't, no one thought twice about this rye when they saw it. And what is so interesting about this ergot is this fungus would be baked into the bread they would make. And this fungus can cause convulsions, muscle spasms, delusions, sensation of crawling under skin.
Interesting.
Also hallucinations. Basically everything that happened.
And it's fascinating because that's a very compelling theory.
Yeah.
And obviously, we're not saying it's 100% the
Right,
cause.
right.
It's probably like most things, a little bit of everything. If you get one or two of these kids experiencing hallucinations and you combine that with the intense religious fervor of the community, that'll carry. So even if one part of it was just this, it could have ignited the whole shebang. Even if not everyone in Salem was tripping balls.
Yes, they're tripping balls. Like we were saying, these girls, not just the girls, but a lot of the people in town were eating this poisoned bread.
Right.
And so a lot of people would just, without knowing so, were having LSD trips.
Wow.
So of course they're thinking that something absolutely out of this world is happening.
Right.
It's unlike anything they could had imagined before, and they had no idea it was coming, obviously.
Right. So it's even more, right.
So it only makes sense that people were really freaking out about this.
Right.
Also, the ergot can cause kind of like a dazedness, or like a kind of like a fuzziness. You know what I just kind of like...
Right.
Kind of puts a veil over you, essentially. And that also explains a lot why those 8 girls and just a lot of the people in general just seemed so like cut off.
Right.
And kind of vacant. Now, ergot has a history along with it that does line up with the witch trials. Now, it has a connection to an even bigger historical event.
Okay.
And that is the Black Plague.
Interesting.
Yes, it is very interesting. So, ergot would extremely weaken the immune system of the people that had it. Some of the people that had the ergot poisoning, the symptoms were very similar to the plague. So there is a chance too that there was some overlap, and maybe some people who thought they had the plague maybe did have ergot poisoning.
Right.
Not saying that the plague was smaller than we thought, nothing like that. It overall was, it really overlapped a lot, but it is just interesting how it played a part then. Also, the plague really got bad in regional pockets.
Right.
Which also kind of explains why maybe the ergot poisoning really, that's what fast forwarded essentially.
Interesting.
The decline of all of the people.
Interesting.
Because the death toll, it's very, very different depending on the pockets you were in. So for example, in the early years of the Black Plague and the Black Death, the population was going down quite quickly, obviously, because of the plague.
Right.
But also at that time, for a large portion of Europe, the conditions were perfect.
Right.
For ergot. Where there's cold weather and a huge high diet of rye,
right,
the population tends to go down.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily true today. You can eat rye bread. Don't worry about this.
Right.
But this is just in the past.
Yeah.
And
might want to rethink that Reuben.
Yeah, be careful. Think about your Reuben. Don't drive in Reuben. With the Salem witch trial, as well as witch trials in Europe, rarely were there witch trials in a place where they did not grow rye. So that is another thing to really kind of put the nail on the coffin there. I think this is fascinating that everywhere that there were witch hunts, there was usually rye being grown. Anywhere where rye wasn't grown, often there weren't big witch hunts there. And it's probably because people weren't accidentally getting high as balls.
Well, citizens of the Milky Way, that's going to wrap us up for the Salem Witch Trials. Maureen, thank you for all that research.
Yeah.
Citizens of the Milky Way, if you'd like to support this show, go to patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. My name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
Good night and goodbye.